In this video, we're going to look at scales that work over dominant seventh chords. I'm going to call them dominant scales for short. I should say I'm not going to talk about all the scales you can use. There are a lot of choices. But we'll look at many of the most important ones, enough anyhow to give you a pretty good sense of the varied landscape. Here we've got a C major scale, with the notes indicated in order of pitch up top, and those same notes indicated on the circle of fifths below. When you look at the circle of fifths, the dark minor sounding notes in the key of C are all on the left side, counterclockwise from C, and the bright major sounding notes are on the right, clockwise of C. Now every dominant chord contains two essential notes. The first is the major third. Our C scale contains the major third, namely E. The other is the minor seventh. Our C scale doesn't contain the minor seventh, B flat, but it does contain B, which is the major seventh. Let's lower the B half a step to B flat. This scale is C Mixolydian. It works well for dominant chords because it has both the essential notes. Together, the major third and minor seventh form a tritone, an interval that spans half an octave or 6 half steps. The tritone supplies the tension that every dominant chord shares. On the circle of fifths, notes that form a tritone are easy to identify because they're directly opposite each other. And we can see that in this scale there's exactly one pair of notes fitting that description, the B flat and the E. No matter what key we're looking at, we can find the minor seventh in the same spot, 2 hours counterclockwise of the root. Remember, that's the dark direction from the root. And the major third will be 4 hours brighter than the root, to the right. For instance, we can see this if we transpose to, say, A. It makes it easier to see if we put the new root up on top. That way the minor seventh and major third are in exactly the same places as before. Let's go back to the key of C and get rid of all the notes except for the third and the seventh. Now suppose we want to build an especially bright sounding scale to use over a C dominant chord. We need to include the B flat and the E and the root C. And apart from those, we can choose any notes we want. So let's choose from the bright ones. Since we have a minor 7 already, we don't want the major 7th. So except for the major 7th, let's add everything on the right side. That's the 5th, the major 2nd, the major 6th, and the sharp 4. The result is Lydian Dominant. It's the brightest of all the dominant scales because all its notes are on the bright side except for the obligatory minor 7th, which it needs to have a dominant sound. Have a listen. For context, here's a C13 sharp 11 chord that you might use the Lydian Dominant scale over. And now the actual scale. You might recognize the visual pattern that the notes make on the circle of fifths. It's not the same as the major scale, which has all its notes adjacent on the circle. As a reminder, here's major again. Instead, Lydian Dominant spreads out further and has a gap just before the last note on each end. This is the shape of the melodic minor scale, and sure enough, Lydian Dominant is a mode of the melodic minor. The notes we're looking at are precisely the notes of G melodic minor. ScaleMate tells us so if we change the root to G. Notice that the wider spread of notes in the melodic minor scale allows it to contain 2 tritones, not just one. And while we're here, watch how if we take the minor third, B flat, and raise it a half step to B, the scale turns into a major scale, and the B flat moves over from the dark side of the circle to the bright side, filling in the 7 adjacent notes that characterize the major scale. Okay, let's go back to our Lydian Dominant scale. This time, instead of bright notes, let's fill the scale with the darkest notes we can. First, let's get rid of everything but the essentials of a dominant chord, namely the root, third, and 7th. Now let's add all the darkest notes. We'll add the minor third, the minor 6th, the minor 2nd, and the flat 5. Does this shape look familiar? It's rotated differently this time because it's in a different mode, but it's the same melodic minor that we saw, right? The notes are all adjacent on the circle of fifths except for the outlier on each end. The notes we're looking at are exactly the notes of the D-flat melodic minor scale. The dark dominant scale we just built is the altered dominant scale, or altered scale. It's the 7th mode of the melodic minor. And C is the 7th note of the D-flat melodic minor scale, so when we shift the notes so that C is the root, we have the C altered scale. The altered scale is the darkest of all the dominant scales. All the notes are on the dark side of the root, except, of course, the one obligatory bright note, the major third, because otherwise it wouldn't be a dominant scale. Here's what the altered scale sounds like. Let's go back for a sec and just look at the third and the seventh again. Since they're a tritone away from each other, if we just move them each by a tritone, they just swap places and there's no change. In other words, if we're in the key of C and we move the root by a tritone, making it F sharp instead of C, then what was the major third becomes the minor seventh, and the minor seventh becomes the major third. The B flat, which was the minor seventh of C, is now spelled as A sharp and is in the major third position, 4 hours brighter than the F sharp. Likewise, the E is now in the minor seventh position, 2 hours darker than the F sharp. This is the idea behind what we call the tritone substitution, that if you replace a dominant chord with the dominant chord a tritone away, the third and the seventh don't change, they just swap positions. So the two chords can function in similar ways. With this in mind, let's go back to the key of C and pull up the whole Lydian Dominant scale. Now watch while we move the root a tritone away to F sharp. You can see that not only do the minor seventh and the major third swap places, but what used to be the entire bright side is now the dark side, and vice versa. Brightness and darkness are inherently relative concepts. They're always relative to a reference point, which for us here is the root. And when we move the root a tritone away to the opposite side of the circle, everything that's bright becomes dark, and what's dark becomes bright. Bright and dark are just like east and west. Say you're in Miami and you travel halfway around the world to Bangkok. Everything that was east of you before is now west of you, and vice versa. For instance, Rome isn't inherently east or west, any more than, say, B flat is inherently bright or dark. Rome is east of Miami, but it's west when you're in Bangkok. And if we pick an example across the world, the converse is true. Any place we look at, like Hawaii, is west from Miami, but east of Bangkok. C and F sharp are diametric opposites on the circle of fifths. They're at opposite sides of the harmonic world, if you will. So think of C as Miami, and F sharp as Bangkok, and east is bright. Everything that's bright from C, like A, is dark from F sharp. And across the globe, everything is dark from C, like E flat, and bright from F sharp. Okay, applying this to dominant chords, we can sum it up like this. Not only is F sharp 7 the tritone sub of C7, but C and F sharp have opposite views of brightness and darkness. So the tritone sub of C Lydian Dominant is F sharp altered, and vice versa. Of all the dominant scales, we've seen the brightest and the darkest. There are lots of others, and they all lie somewhere in between. Each one includes the minor seventh and the major third, so in a sense the simplest scale is the one that includes those two notes, plus just the 5 notes in between. Recognize it? It's the Mixolydian scale we saw before. You can see it's pretty bright, but a bit less so than Lydian Dominant. It has 2 notes on the dark side, whereas Lydian Dominant has just the one required minor seventh. The notes of Mixolydian are all packed together on the circle of fifths. They're adjacent to each other, and that's the telltale sign that it's a mode of the major scale. You can see the notes are all centered around 1 o'clock on the circle, which is the perfect fifth. So all in all, it's just slightly bright compared to the root at 12 o'clock. The notes of Lydian Dominant aren't as consolidated on the circle as Mixolydian. Still, we can say that they're centered around 2 o'clock, which is the major second. So you can think of them as 1 notch brighter than Mixolydian. We know the darkest dominant scale is the altered scale. Since its notes are diametrically opposite the Lydian Dominant notes, they're concentrated 180 degrees away, 4 notches darker than the root. For a dark scale that isn't quite as dark as altered, look at Phrygian Dominant. It's also known as the 5th mode of the harmonic minor scale. We can get it by removing the flat 5 and sharp 9 from altered, and replacing them with a perfect fourth and fifth. That makes the tonal focus less extreme than the super dark altered scale. This is what it sounds like. Lastly, let's look at a couple common scales that are pretty different from the ones we've seen. This is a diminished scale, the C half-whole diminished scale. It's a dominant scale because it contains the minor seventh and the major third, but check out how evenly the notes are spread out around the circle of fifths. You can see that every note in the scale is balanced by another note directly across, a tritone away. Scales like this are called symmetrical. They're also called modes of limited transposition. The reason why they're interesting here is this. Because they're balanced around the circle of fifths, they have no tonal focus. There's no side of the circle where the notes concentrate, not even a little. So they're neither bright nor dark. And that's true regardless of what mode of a symmetrical scale you look at, which is to say, however you rotate it around the circle, it's neither bright nor dark. That's not to say that symmetrical scales don't have bright and dark notes, just that they're equally balanced. For instance, in this diminished scale, the minor second and minor third are quite dark, whereas the major third and major sixth are bright. Another dominant scale that's symmetrical is the whole tone scale. Again, we can see that it consists of nothing but tritone pairs, this time just 3. And again, the notes don't concentrate anywhere on the circle. It's neither bright nor dark. One last observation. The more tonal focus a scale has, the less dissonance it's going to contain among its notes. That's because the dissonant intervals are the ones between notes that are far apart on the circle of fifths, the tritone where the two notes are opposite, and the semitone where the notes are 5 hours apart. Look at the Mixolydian scale, with just one tritone and 2 semitones. Let's have ScaleMate play a random passage using Mixolydian. And now look at the diminished scale with 4 tritones and 4 semitones. Here's a random passage from that scale. Listen to how much more discordant it is. That's all for this video. Hope you found it interesting. Please leave a comment and check out the ScaleMate app. There are links below.